You're just a passenger." My ex-wife and her new husband sneered on the plane. Then the engine failed. The pilot whispered my call sign. "Get me Upsilon Spectre from row 9 now." I walked into the cockpit and spoke 3 sentences in Dutch that saved 200 lives. My ex-wife watched, frozen in disbelief. You know how some flights feel like they're going to drag on forever? This wasn't one of those. Hell, I wished it was. Every minute in that cramped airplane seat was another minute I didn't have to face what was waiting for me back home in New York. Mom's funeral. The whole damn family gathering around her casket, pretending they gave a shit about each other for one afternoon. My name's Jackson Reeve, though most folks who knew me in my Air Force days called me Spectre. 38 years old, and right now I'm just another guy in coach, squeezed into row 9 like a sardine. The flight attendant had offered me peanuts twice already, and we hadn't even taken off from Amsterdam yet. I declined both times. My stomach was twisted up tighter than a drill sergeant's bootlaces. The irony wasn't lost on me that I used to fly jets that could break the sound barrier, and here I was, white-knuckling it as a passenger on a commercial flight. But that's what happens when you wash out of the military with a psychological evaluation that reads like a horror novel. Unstable under pressure, they'd written. Not suitable for continued flight operations. Bullshit bureaucratic way of saying I'd cracked under the weight of too many missions and not enough sleep. That's when I noticed them. Across the aisle, 2 seats over. Marielle, my ex-wife, looking like she'd stepped out of some fancy magazine with her perfectly styled blonde hair and that designer outfit that probably cost more than my rent. And next to her, the golden boy himself, Brent Hollings. My replacement in more ways than one. Brent was everything I wasn't. Clean-cut corporate consultant with manicured nails and a smile that screamed, "I've never had a bad day in my life." The kind of guy who probably used words like synergy in casual conversation and thought a rough day meant his latte was served at the wrong temperature. He wore his arrogance like expensive cologne. Thick, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. I tried to focus on the window, watching the ground crew scurrying around below like ants. Amsterdam Schiphol Airport was busy as always, planes lined up on the tarmac like toys waiting their turn. But I could feel Marielle's eyes on me. Could practically hear the gears turning in her head as she worked up the courage to say whatever poison she'd been cooking up. She didn't disappoint. Well, she said, loud enough that half the cabin could hear her. That voice I used to love, now sharp as broken glass. "Jackson Reeve, what are the odds?" I didn't turn around. Didn't give her the satisfaction. 2 years of silence, and I wasn't about to break it now just because we were trapped in a metal tube together for the next 8 hours. But Marielle, she never knew when to quit. That's probably why our marriage went down in flames faster than a MiG with a busted engine. "You know, Brent," she continued, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "This is my ex-husband I told you about. The one who used to fly those big military jets." She paused for effect, like she was setting up the punchline to some cruel joke. Of course, that was before he washed out. Now look at him. I felt Brent's eyes boring into the back of my skull. Could practically hear him sizing me up, probably wondering how this broken-down former pilot had ever landed a woman like Marielle. Fair question, honestly. Then came the line that cut deeper than she probably intended. "You're just a passenger now, Jackson," Marielle said, her voice carrying that cold satisfaction that told me she'd been rehearsing this moment. Just another passenger. Brent's laugh was exactly what you'd expect, polished, practiced, and completely hollow. The kind of laugh that got him through corporate boardrooms and dinner parties with people he couldn't stand. But it did the job. Other passengers were starting to stare. Some probably recognized the drama unfolding and were settling in for the show. I kept my eyes forward, watching a luggage cart weave between the planes outside. My hands were steady on the armrests, muscle memory from years of flight training, keeping them locked in place even when everything inside me wanted to turn around and remind Marielle exactly who she was talking to. But she was right, wasn't she? I was just a passenger now. No call sign, no mission, no purpose beyond getting from point A to point B like everybody else. The mighty Spectre, reduced to hoping the real pilots up front knew what they were doing. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, smooth and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're next in line for takeoff. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for departure." I closed my eyes and tried to center myself the way they'd taught us during stress management training. Count your breathing. Focus on what you can control. Let go of what you can't. All that psychological warfare bullshit they fed us before sending us into combat zones. The engines started their familiar whine, building up power. Even in coach, even as a passenger, I could feel the aircraft coming alive around me. The vibration through the seats, the subtle shift as the pilot tested the controls, the way the whole plane seemed to hold its breath before takeoff. This was the part one used to love most. That moment when tons of metal and fuel and human hopes defied gravity and lifted off into the sky. Used to give me chills every single time, whether I was flying or just riding along. Marielle was still talking to Brent, probably explaining how I'd lost it during my last deployment. How I'd come home different. Broken. How she tried to make it work, but couldn't live with someone who jumped at every loud noise and woke up screaming from nightmares about missions gone wrong. She wasn't lying about any of it. That was the hell of it. The aircraft lurched forward, beginning its taxi toward the runway. Through the window, I watched Amsterdam shrink away, preparing to become just another dot on the map behind us. In a few hours, we'd be touching down in New York, and I'd have to face whatever was left of my family. Face the reality that Mom was gone, and I hadn't been there when it mattered. But right now, in this moment before takeoff, I was still just a passenger. Still invisible. Still safe in the anonymity of row 9, seat C. That silence Marielle was so proud of breaking. It was about to end. Not with words, though. Never was much good with words anyway. No, when my silence finally broke, it would be with action. The kind of action that reminded everyone exactly who Spectre used to be. The boarding process dragged on like it always does. People fumbling with overhead bins, flight attendants doing their safety dance, passengers arguing over seat assignments like their lives depended on it. I kept my eyes glued to the window, watching the ground crew finish up their pre-flight checks. Old habits die hard, and even as a passenger, I found myself mentally running through the same checklist I used to go through as a pilot. Fuel lines disconnected. Check. Ground power unit rolling away. Check. Wing flaps in position. Check. The familiar hum started deep in the belly of the aircraft as the engines began their startup sequence. Most passengers probably didn't even notice it, but I felt it in my bones. That low, steady vibration that meant we were about to trust our lives to a couple of turbofan engines and the laws of physics. I closed my eyes and started counting. It was something I'd picked up during my Air Force days, a nervous habit that had somehow stuck around long after I'd been grounded. Count the vibrations. Feel the rhythm. Every aircraft had its own heartbeat, its own signature hum that told you everything was working the way it should. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. The port engine was running smooth, RPMs climbing steadily. The starboard engine followed suit a few seconds later, and I could feel the whole airframe settling into that steady, confident rumble that meant business. Behind me, I heard some kid asking his mom when we were going to take off, and a businessman complaining into his phone about delayed conference calls. Just another day at 30,000 feet. Just another routine flight with a couple hundred people who had no clue how many things could go wrong between here and New York. But then, halfway through the boarding process, something changed. It started as a flutter. Just a tiny irregularity in the engine noise that probably nobody else even noticed. But I'd spent enough years listening to aircraft engines to know when something wasn't quite right. The vibration pattern shifted, just for a second, like the plane had hiccuped. I opened my eyes and glanced toward the wing. Everything looked normal from where I was sitting. No smoke, no sparks, no obvious signs of trouble. But that flutter was still there, buried underneath the normal engine noise like a whisper you couldn't quite make out. Maybe I was being paranoid. Hell, I probably was. 2 years of therapy and enough anti-anxiety medication to stock a pharmacy, and I was still jumping at shadows. Still hearing problems that weren't really there. The flight attendants were going through their final safety checks, that choreographed routine about seat belts and oxygen masks that everyone ignores. A few more passengers were still filtering in, dragging their carry-on bags and looking for their assigned seats. Everything was normal. Everything was fine, except for that damn flutter. I tried to shake it off, tried to focus on something else. Through the window, I could see the control tower in the distance, probably coordinating our departure slot with air traffic control. The ground was still wet from an earlier rain shower, and the late afternoon sun was painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Then it happened. The explosion hit like a sledgehammer to the gut. 1 second, I was counting engine vibrations and watching raindrops on the window. The next second, the entire aircraft bucked like an angry horse, throwing passengers against their seat backs and sending carry-on bags flying out of overhead compartments that hadn't been properly latched. The sound was indescribable, not just loud, but physically painful, like standing too close to a thunderclap or being inside a cannon when it goes off. The kind of sound that doesn't just hit your ears but rattles your teeth and makes your chest cavity vibrate. People started screaming immediately. Not the excited screaming you hear on roller coasters, but the raw, primal screaming that comes from realizing you might be about to die. A woman 3 rows up was clutching her infant, tears streaming down her face. An old man across the aisle was gripping his armrest so tight his knuckles had gone white. Overhead bins popped open like jack-in-the-boxes, spilling laptops and purses and duty-free shopping bags into the aisles. The cabin lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Emergency lighting strips along the floors started glowing that eerie green color that means things have gone seriously sideways. And then came the smell. Burning chemicals. Hot metal. That acrid, choking stench that tells you something important just broke in a very bad way. It filled the cabin like smoke from a house fire, making people cough and gag and panic even harder. The oxygen masks dropped. Those yellow plastic cups that everyone jokes about during the safety demonstration suddenly weren't so funny anymore. They dangled from the ceiling like dead flowers, swaying back and forth as the aircraft continued to shudder and buck. I grabbed mine without thinking, muscle memory from countless emergency drills taking over. Put your own mask on first, then help others. Basic survival training that had been drilled into my head so many times, it was practically hardwired. Around me, panic was spreading like wildfire. Parents were trying to help their kids with masks while struggling to get their own on. Flight attendants were shouting instructions that nobody could hear over the screaming and the alarms that were now blaring throughout the cabin. I turned to check on Marielle and Brent, some stupid instinct making me want to help them despite everything that had gone down between us. Brent's face had gone completely white, like someone had drained all the blood out of him. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and his expensive suit was wrinkled where he'd been thrown against his seat. But it was Marielle who really caught my attention. She was frozen, absolutely frozen, with her hand gripping the armrest so tight I thought she might break her fingers. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she was staring straight ahead like she couldn't process what was happening. I'd seen that look before. In combat zones, when everything went to hell and people's minds just couldn't keep up with reality. Shell shock, they used to call it. Now they have fancier names for it, but it's the same thing. The moment when your brain hits the emergency stop button and leaves you paralyzed. That's when I heard it. Cutting through all the chaos, all the screaming and alarms and sounds of an aircraft in serious trouble, came a voice over the intercom. Calm, quiet, almost conversational, like someone was asking about the weather. Get me Spectre. Row 9. The words hit me like a physical blow. Nobody had called me Spectre in 2 years. Nobody except the guys I'd served with, and most of them were either dead or had moved on to other things. But somehow, someone up in that cockpit knew exactly who I was and exactly where I was sitting. Brent looked confused, probably wondering what the hell a Spectre was and why anyone would be looking for one during an emergency. But Marielle's expression had changed. The frozen terror was still there, but underneath it was something else. Recognition. Understanding. She knew what that call sign meant. She knew what I used to be capable of. I stood up, my legs steady despite the aircraft's continued shuddering. Around me, people were still screaming and crying and praying to whatever gods they believed in. But for the first time in 2 years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten. Purpose. The silence was about to end. Not with words, but with action. The flight attendant appeared out of nowhere, moving through the chaos like she was swimming upstream through a river of panic. Her uniform was wrinkled, her hair had come loose from its professional bond, and there was a small cut on her forehead that she probably hadn't even noticed yet. But her voice was steady, trained, the kind of calm that comes from years of dealing with emergencies both real and imagined. "Sir, please return to your seat," she said, reaching out to grab my arm. "We need everyone to remain seated and—" "Check the manifest," I interrupted, not moving an inch. My voice came out steady, authoritative. The same tone I'd used when giving orders to my squadron back, when orders actually meant something. Jackson Reeve. Call sign Spectre. Her hand froze mid-reach. I watched her face change as the information clicked into place, watched her eyes go from professional concern to something approaching awe. She pulled out a small tablet from her pocket, the kind flight attendants used to track passengers and meal preferences and God knows what else. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen, scrolling through what I assumed was the passenger manifest. Then she stopped, looked at the screen, looked at me, back to the screen. Holy shit, she whispered, and I could tell she immediately regretted the language. But sometimes profanity is the only honest response to an impossible situation. Yeah, I said simply. Now step aside. She didn't hesitate. Professional training kicked in, and she moved out of my way like I was carrying a presidential order. Behind me, I could hear Brent's voice cutting through the chaos, high-pitched and confused. What the hell is going on? Who is he? Marielle, what's happening? But I didn't look back. Couldn't afford to. Whatever was wrong with this aircraft was getting worse by the second. I could feel it in the way the floor tilted slightly to the left, in the way the engine noise had changed from a steady rumble to something more irregular, more desperate. The walk to the cockpit felt like it took forever, even though it was probably less than 30 seconds. Every step was a fight against the aircraft's increasingly erratic movements. Passengers were still screaming, still crying, still trying to figure out how to use oxygen masks that most of them had never taken seriously during the safety briefing. A businessman in first class grabbed my arm as I passed. Are you crew? What's happening? Are we going to be okay? I looked down at him. Middle-aged guy in an expensive suit, probably heading to New York for some corporate meeting that had seemed incredibly important an hour ago. Now he looked like a scared kid who'd lost his parents in a shopping mall. We're going to be fine, I told him, and I meant it. Not because I knew everything would work out, but because I was going to make damn sure it did. The cockpit door was already open when I reached it. Emergency protocol. In a crisis, that door stays unlocked, so help can get through if needed. Smart policy, though it probably scared the hell out of passengers who could see into the flight deck and witness whatever chaos was happening up front. What I saw when I stepped inside wasn't encouraging. The co-pilot was slumped over his controls, conscious but barely. Blood was trickling from a gash on his scalp where he'd probably been thrown against something during the explosion. His hands were shaking, and he kept trying to focus on the instrument panel like he couldn't quite make sense of what he was seeing. The captain was still in his seat, still fighting with the controls, but I could see the strain in his shoulders and the sweat on his forehead. He was a big guy, probably in his 50s, with the kind of weathered face that said he'd been flying commercial aircraft for decades. But right now he looked like he was wrestling with something that was winning. He glanced up when I entered, and for a split second I saw relief flash across his face. Not because he recognized me, but because someone, anyone, had answered his call for help. Spectre, he asked, his accent thick with Dutch inflection. Jackson Reeve, I confirmed, already moving toward the co-pilot's seat. Former USAF combat pilot. Multilingual, NATO certified. What's the situation? That was military speak for, cut the bullshit and tell me how fucked we are, but I figured I'd keep it professional for now. The captain didn't waste time with pleasantries. Right engine is completely dead. Left engine is running hot, losing power. We've lost hydraulic pressure in 2 systems, autopilot is offline, and the flight management computer is giving us garbage data. I was already sliding into the co-pilot's seat, gently moving the injured man aside. My hands found the controls automatically, muscle memory taking over like I'd never left a cockpit. The yoke felt familiar under my palms. The rudder pedals responded to the pressure of my feet, and suddenly I wasn't just a passenger anymore. I was a pilot. The instrument panel told the story in stark, unforgiving numbers. Engine temperature climbing into the red zone. Fuel flow irregularities. Electrical systems showing intermittent failures. Altitude dropping slowly but steadily. How long since the explosion? I asked, my eyes scanning the displays, my brain automatically cataloging problems and potential solutions. 3 minutes, the captain replied. Maybe 4. That meant we had maybe 20 minutes before the remaining engine gave up completely. 20 minutes to find a place to land a crippled aircraft with 200 souls on board. What's your name, Captain? Vanderberg. Eric Vanderberg. All right, Eric. I need you to stay calm and follow my lead. We're going to get through this. Warning lights were flashing across the panel like a Christmas tree designed by someone with a really dark sense of humor. But I'd seen worse. Hell, I'd flown through worse. The difference was that back then, I'd only been responsible for my own life. Now I had an entire passenger manifest depending on me not screwing this up. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time, and I heard fresh screams from the cabin behind us. Eric's knuckles were white where he gripped his controls. "She's getting harder to control," he said through gritted teeth. "I know," I replied, adjusting the trim to compensate for the loss of power from the dead engine. "But she's still flying. As long as she's flying, we've got options." That was pilot philosophy 101. Every problem has a solution as long as you're still in the air. It was when you stopped flying that things got really complicated. I looked out the windscreen at the Dutch countryside passing below us. Flat green fields, small towns, roads that looked like pencil lines drawn on a map. Somewhere down there was a runway long enough to handle a commercial airliner. I just had to find it before we ran out of sky. "Eric," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos surrounding us. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" He looked at me for a long moment. This stranger who'd walked into his cockpit during the worst day of his flying career. Then he nodded. "Good. Now let's bring this." My hands moved across the control panel with the kind of precision that comes from years of training and muscle memory that never really goes away. Eric was doing his best to maintain level flight, but I could see the strain in his shoulders as he fought against the aircraft's tendency to yaw left with only one functioning engine. That's when I spotted it. A panel that most commercial pilots probably never touch in their entire careers. Hell, most of them probably don't even know it exists. But I did, because back in my Air Force days, we trained on everything from crop dusters to cargo haulers, and sometimes you needed to talk to people who weren't expecting to hear from you. The emergency communications panel was tucked away behind a hinged cover marked with warnings in 3 languages. I flipped it up, revealing a collection of switches, dials, and frequency selectors that looked like they belonged on a military aircraft rather than a commercial airliner. "What are you doing?" Eric asked, glancing over while still wrestling with the controls. "Getting us some help," I replied, my fingers dancing across the frequency selector. This bird's got more comm equipment than they advertise in the passenger brochure. The emergency comm system was designed for exactly this kind of situation, when regular air traffic control channels were jammed, or when you needed to reach specific agencies that operated on classified frequencies. Most civilian pilots never learned how to use it because they never needed to. But I wasn't most pilots. I keyed in a frequency that I hadn't used in over 2 years, one that was burned into my memory alongside a dozen others that the Air Force had made me memorize during my NATO certification training. My finger hovered over the transmit button for just a second. This was it. The moment when I stopped being Jackson Reeve, washed-up ex-pilot, and became Spectre again. The moment when all those sleepless nights and psychological evaluations and therapy sessions either meant something or meant nothing at all. I pressed the button and spoke 3 sentences in Dutch. "Died Inspector." Nammergelijk. The first sentence was identification. This is a Spectre, using the old NATO phonetic code that predated the current system. Any military controller worth his salt would recognize it immediately and know they were dealing with someone who had clearance levels that went way beyond civilian aviation. The response came back almost immediately, crackling through the speaker with the kind of crisp professionalism that told me I'd reached exactly who I needed to reach. "Spectre, authenticate with personal call sign and service number." I rattled off my old squadron designation and service number, information that was supposedly classified, but that any real controller would have access to within seconds. While I waited for confirmation, I continued with the second sentence. "Bevestigd coördinatie." Confirm coordination. Military speak for, I need you to talk to multiple agencies at once and make sure everyone's on the same page. In this case, that meant Amsterdam Operations Center, Shamwick Oceanic Control, and probably a half-dozen other agencies that tracked aircraft movements across European airspace. The confirmation came back 30 seconds later, along with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who'd been doing this job for longer than I'd been alive. "Spectre, this is Amsterdam Military Control. We have your emergency status confirmed. Stand by for coordination with civilian ATC." That's when I delivered the third sentence. the one that would either save our asses or get us all killed. Handhoff Nudglidpad. Maintain emergency glide path. It was a request for priority handling and emergency routing, the kind of thing that would clear other aircraft out of our way and give us direct vectors to the nearest suitable airport. But more than that, it was a signal that whoever was flying this aircraft knew exactly what they were doing and had the authority to make decisions that civilian pilots couldn't make. Within seconds, data started pouring in through the emergency comm system. Wind vectors at multiple altitudes, weather conditions at potential diversion airports, fuel calculations and glide ratios, and a dozen other pieces of information that could mean the difference between a successful emergency landing and a smoking crater in the Dutch countryside. But the most important thing was the voice that came through the speaker next, calm, professional, and speaking English with just a hint of a Dutch accent. Spectre, Amsterdam Operations Center. We have emergency vectors to Focal Air Base, bearing 270, distance 42 nautical miles. Runway is being cleared for emergency landing. Focal. I knew that name. Former NATO base, built during the Cold War when everyone was worried about Soviet bombers coming over the pole. Long runway, built to handle everything from fighter jets to heavy cargo aircraft. If we could make it that far, we had a chance. Eric was staring at me like I'd just performed some kind of magic trick. Who are you talking to? People who know how to handle emergencies. I replied, already plotting our course to Focal on the navigation display. Military controllers don't panic, and they don't ask stupid questions. They just get shit done. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time, and I felt the remaining engine lose another few hundred RPMs. We were running out of time, but now we had a destination and people on the ground who were actively working to help us get there. Behind us, I could hear the chaos continuing in the passenger cabin. People were still crying, still praying, still asking flight attendants questions that didn't have good answers. But they didn't need to know about wind vectors and glide ratios and emergency frequencies. They just needed to trust that the people in the cockpit knew what they were doing. And for the first time in 2 years, I actually did. The radio crackled again, this time with a different voice, younger, more urgent. Spectre, be advised we have emergency vehicles standing by at Focal. Medical personnel are being notified for potential casualties. What is your passenger count and fuel status? 237 souls on board. I replied, reading the numbers off the manifest display. Fuel is... I checked the gauges, did some quick math in my head. Fuel is going to be tight. We'll have maybe 10 minutes of power left when we reach your coordinates. Copy that, Spectre. You are cleared direct to Focal. Maintain present heading. All other traffic has been diverted. I looked over at Eric, who was still fighting to keep the aircraft level and stable despite the increasing vibrations from our failing engine. Sweat was beading on his forehead, but his hands were steady on the controls. You ever land a commercial airliner on a military runway? I asked him. He shook his head. Never. Well, I said, adjusting our heading to take us directly toward Focal. There's a first time for everything. The Dutch countryside was sliding past below us, green fields and small towns that looked peaceful and normal from 30,000 feet. People down there were probably going about their daily lives, completely unaware that a crippled airliner was limping across the sky above them. But we weren't passengers anymore. We were pilots with a mission, and that mission was to get 237 people safely back to the ground. Time to see if Spectre still had what it took. The right engine died with a sound I'll never forget. Not a dramatic explosion or a grinding mechanical failure, but a simple, terrifying silence. One moment it was struggling, coughing and sputtering like an old man with lung disease, and the next moment it just stopped. The vibration that had been rattling through the aircraft suddenly cut off, leaving us with an eerie quiet that was somehow worse than all the alarms and warnings. Eric's face went pale as he watched the engine parameters flatline on his display. Flame out, he said quietly, like he was announcing someone's death, which, in a way, he was. I was already adjusting the rudder to compensate for the asymmetric thrust, but I could feel the aircraft wanting to yaw to the right, wanting to spiral into the ground because physics doesn't give a damn about our hopes and prayers. The remaining engine was working overtime now, carrying the full load of keeping us airborne, and I could see from the instrument readings that it wasn't happy about the situation. Engine 2 temperature is climbing, I reported, watching the numbers tick upward into the yellow zone. Not red yet, but getting there fast. We're asking too much of it. How long before it overheats? Eric asked, though I could tell from his expression that he already knew the answer wouldn't be good. I did the math in my head, factoring in our current power setting, outside air temperature, and the rate at which the engine temperature was climbing. Military training had drilled these calculations into my brain until they became automatic, like multiplication tables for pilots. Maybe 10 minutes, I said. 15 if we're lucky. Eric was quiet for a moment, absorbing what that meant. With one engine completely dead and the other one about to cook itself to death, we weren't flying anymore. We were gliding, a 170-ton metal bird with nowhere to land and gravity pulling us steadily toward the Dutch countryside. The aircraft shuddered as I reduced power to the remaining engine, trying to buy us a few more minutes before it overheated completely. But reducing power meant losing altitude faster, which meant less time to find a suitable runway. It was a losing game no matter how you played it. There, Eric said suddenly, pointing to a spot on the navigation display. Twin Air Base. Old military installation, about 40 kilometers northeast. The runway is long enough, and it's still maintained for emergency landings. I pulled up the coordinates on my display and felt my stomach drop. 40 kilometers might as well have been 400 given our current situation. With no engine power and our altitude bleeding away like water through a broken dam, we'd be lucky to glide half that distance. What about closer options? I asked, though I was already calculating glide ratios and wind vectors, trying to squeeze every possible mile out of our descent. Eric shook his head. Nothing suitable. There are some smaller airfields, but the runways are too short for a commercial aircraft. We'd overshoot and end up in a farmer's field, which wouldn't necessarily be fatal if the field was long enough and flat enough. But crashing into a barn or a grove of trees at 150 miles per hour wasn't anyone's idea of a good time. Better to aim for a proper runway and hope we could stretch our glide just far enough to reach it. The second engine temperature gauge was climbing steadily into the red zone now. I could almost hear it screaming under the strain, metal expanding beyond its design limits, bearings running dry, turbine blades vibrating at frequencies that would tear the whole assembly apart. We're going to lose the second engine, I told Eric, my voice matter of fact despite the implications. There was no point in sugarcoating reality. Question is whether it flames out or explodes first. What's the difference? If it flames out, we glide. If it explodes, we might lose hydraulics, flight controls, maybe part of the wing. At that point, we're not landing anywhere. Eric's hands tightened on his yoke. 23 years of flying commercial aircraft, and he'd probably never faced anything worse than rough turbulence or a drunk passenger. Now he was looking at the very real possibility of becoming a statistic in aviation accident reports. The radio crackled with updates from Amsterdam Operations Center. Emergency services were mobilizing at Twin Air Base, but they were also being honest about our chances. The air traffic controller's voice was professional and calm, but I could hear the undertone of concern. KLM 447. Be advised that your current glide path will bring you approximately 8 kilometers short of twinned runway. Do you have any options for extending your glide? 8 kilometers. Might as well be 800. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. Dump weight, I told Eric. Everything we can get rid of? Fuel, water, whatever's not bolted down. The passengers will thank us when we're all walking away from this instead of being scraped off a farmer's field with a spatula. Eric's fingers moved across the fuel management panel, opening valves that would dump thousands of pounds of jet fuel into the atmosphere. Not exactly environmentally friendly, but the trees would forgive us if we managed to avoid crashing into them. I adjusted the aircraft's pitch attitude, trading speed for distance, trying to maximize our glide ratio. It was a delicate balance. Too steep and we'd fall short of the runway. Too shallow and we'd stall and fall like a rock. The remaining engine temperature was pegged in the red zone now, and I could see warning lights starting to flash across the engine display. Metal fatigue, oil pressure dropping, vibration levels climbing toward dangerous territory. It's going to let go, Eric said quietly, watching the same instruments I was. I know. What do we do when it does? I looked out the windscreen at the Dutch landscape below. Fields and farms and small towns where people were probably going about their normal Saturday afternoon routines, completely unaware that a crippled airliner was limping through the sky above them. "We land it like a glider," I said, and I meant it. Big, heavy, fast glider, but still just a glider. Eric stared at me like I'd suggested we flap our arms and fly. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious. I've done it before." That was a lie. I'd never landed a commercial airliner with no engines, because that was the kind of thing that happened maybe once in a pilot's career if they were extremely unlucky. But I'd trained for it, simulated it, studied every case of successful deadstick landings in aviation history. Theory was about to become practice, and practice was about to become survival. The second engine made a sound like a garbage disposal trying to digest a wrench, then went silent. We were gliding now. 200 souls in a metal tube, trusting gravity and aerodynamics to carry us to safety. "Hold steady," I murmured, more to myself than to Eric. "We'll make it," because the alternative wasn't acceptable. Flying a dead airliner is nothing like flying a glider. Gliders are built for this. Lightweight, sleek, designed to ride air currents like a bird. A commercial airliner without engines is basically a 170-ton brick with wings, falling out of the sky at a rate that would make Sir Isaac Newton proud and everyone else terrified. But here's the thing about bricks. If you know what you're doing, you can make them skip across water. And if you're really good, really lucky, and really desperate, you can make them land on runways. The silence in the cockpit was deafening now that both engines were dead. No more comforting rumble, no more steady vibration through the airframe. Just the whistle of wind over the wings and the occasional creak of metal adjusting to stresses it was never designed to handle. It was like being in a library where the books were all about death and the librarian was gravity itself. I had manual controls only now. No hydraulic assist, no fly-by-wire computer helping me out. Just old-school stick and rudder flying, muscle against physics, experience against entropy. My hands gripped the yoke like I was holding onto the edge of a cliff, because in a way, I was. Eric was calling out our parameters in a steady stream. Altitude, airspeed, heading, rate of descent. His voice was calm and professional, but I could hear the underlying tension. 23 years of flying, and he'd never been in a situation where the manual said, "Sorry, you're on your own." Altitude 8,000 feet, descending at 1,200 feet per minute, he reported. Airspeed 280 knots and decreasing. I was flying the aircraft by feel now, using every trick I'd learned in military training. Adjust the pitch to maintain best glide speed. Use the rudder to keep us coordinated. Watch the horizon and trust your instruments, even when your gut is telling you that falling out of the sky can't possibly end well. Behind us, through the thin cockpit door, I could hear the chaos in the passenger cabin. People were crying, praying, making phone calls to loved ones. Flight attendants were trying to keep everyone calm while probably fighting their own terror. And somewhere in that mess, Marielle and Brent were dealing with the fact that their lives now depended on the unstable ex-husband they'd been mocking an hour ago. Brent's voice cut through the cabin noise, high-pitched with panic. Is he actually flying this thing?" I couldn't hear Marielle's response, but I could imagine it. She'd seen me in uniform, back when we were married. She'd heard the stories about emergency landings and close calls. She knew what I was capable of, even if she'd forgotten during the divorce proceedings. Damn right I was. No autopilot, no engine power, no margin for error whatsoever. Just me, the laws of physics, and a whole lot of stubbornness. The aircraft was getting harder to control as our airspeed decreased. Without engine thrust to help maintain control authority, I was having to work harder to keep us flying straight and level. The control surfaces were becoming mushy, less responsive, like trying to steer a car through molasses. 6,000 feet. Eric called out. We're going to be short of the runway. I could see Twin Air Base in the distance now, a gray smudge against the green Dutch countryside. The runway looked impossibly small from this altitude, like a pencil line someone had drawn with a ruler. But it was there, and it was our only shot. The problem was that Eric was right. We were going to be short. Not by much, maybe a kilometer or two, but in aviation, close doesn't count. You either make the runway or you don't, and almost gets you a smoking crater instead of a successful landing. I pushed the nose down slightly, trading altitude for airspeed, trying to stretch our glide just a little farther. It was a dangerous game. Too much speed, and we'd overshoot the runway even if we reached it Too little, and we'd stall and drop like a stone. For 1,000 feet, Eric reported. Rate of descent is increasing. That's when the smoke started filling the cabin. It wasn't engine smoke. Those were dead and couldn't produce smoke anymore. This was electrical smoke, the acrid smell of burning insulation and overheated circuits. Some system that wasn't designed to operate without engine power was slowly cooking itself to death. People started coughing and panicking even more. I could hear flight attendants shouting instructions about covering noses and mouths with clothing. The emergency lighting was still working, casting that eerie green glow throughout the cabin, but I wondered how long the battery power would last. We need to get on the ground now, I told Eric, though he already knew that. The gear, he said suddenly. Should we deploy the landing gear? That was the million-dollar question. Lowering the gear would increase our drag significantly, making us fall faster, but also helping us slow down for landing. The problem was timing. Deploy it too early and we'd never reach the runway. Deploy it too late and we'd hit the ground too fast to survive. Not yet, I decided. We need every foot of glide we can get. I could see the runway clearly now, a concrete strip carved out of the green landscape. Emergency vehicles were lined up along the sides, fire trucks, ambulances, rescue equipment. They were expecting us, which was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because help was standing by, terrifying because they obviously didn't expect this to go well. 2,000 feet, Eric called out. We're still going to be short. I looked at the instrument panel, calculating distances and angles and descent rates with the part of my brain that had been trained for exactly this kind of impossible situation. We were close, so damn close, but close wasn't going to cut it. That's when I made a decision that would either save us all or kill us all. I'm going to force the gear down manually, I announced. Eric's eyes widened. Without hydraulics? That's impossible. Watch me. I reached for the manual gear extension handle, a piece of equipment that most commercial pilots never touch in their entire careers. It was designed for emergencies exactly like this one, but using it was a gamble. The gear might lock properly, or it might not. It might slow us down enough to make the runway, or it might create so much drag that we'd fall short and crash into the trees. But doing nothing guaranteed failure, and I hadn't come this far to give up now. 1,000 feet, Eric said quietly. This is going to be rough. I pulled the manual gear extension handle with everything I had. I know. Brace for. The ground rushed up at us like an angry fist, and for a split second I wondered if this was how it was going to end. Not in some heroic blaze of glory, but with me making a crater in a Dutch farmer's field while 200 people screamed my name in terror instead of gratitude. The manual gear extension handle had taken every ounce of strength I had, and I still wasn't sure if it had worked. There was supposed to be a mechanical indicator showing gear position, but half the instruments on the panel were either dead or giving me readings that made no sense. Flying by the seat of your pants takes on a whole new meaning when you're literally guessing whether your landing gear is locked into position. The runway at Twin Air Base looked impossibly narrow from this angle, like trying to thread a needle while riding a roller coaster. What had seemed like a reasonable target from higher altitude now looked like a postage stamp surrounded by trees, buildings, and all kinds of obstacles that would turn our emergency landing into a spectacular fireball. Eric was calling out altitudes like a countdown to doomsday. 500 feet, 400, 300. I could see individual emergency vehicles now, lined up along the runway like toys arranged by a kid playing disaster. Fire trucks with their red lights flashing, ambulances standing by, rescue crews who probably had families they wanted to go home to after what was about to happen. 200 feet, Eric said, his voice tight with concentration. Speed 180 knots. We're coming in hot. Too hot. Way too hot. But there wasn't anything I could do about it now except ride this thing down and hope the runway was long enough to handle an aircraft that was basically a guided missile with passengers. The nose was pointing down at an angle that would have made my old flight instructor have a heart attack. This wasn't a normal approach by any stretch of the imagination. This was a controlled crash, and the controlled part was debatable. 100 feet, Eric announced. Time slowed down the way it does in moments of absolute crisis. I could see every detail of the runway surface, every crack in the concrete, every painted line that marked where normal aircraft were supposed to touch down. Normal aircraft with working engines and hydraulic systems and pilots who weren't trying to land a brick with wings. I made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal. I slammed the nose down first. In normal landing procedures, you touch down on the main gear first, then lower the nose wheel gently. But this wasn't a normal landing, and I needed to know if our gear was actually locked before I committed to putting the full weight of the aircraft on it. The nose gear hit the runway with a sound like a gunshot, followed by a bone-jarring impact that rattled every rivet in the airframe. The aircraft bounced slightly, a good sign, because it meant the gear was holding, then settled back down with a grinding, scraping noise that sounded like the world's largest cheese grater. "Gear is down," Eric shouted, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "We have contact." But we weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. I leveled the aircraft and brought the main landing gear down onto the runway. The impact was tremendous, harder than any landing I'd ever made in my life. The passengers behind us must have felt like they were in a car accident, thrown against their seat belts with enough force to leave bruises. Sparks flew from the landing gear, bright orange streaks in my peripheral vision. The rubber tires were probably disintegrating under the stress, but as long as the metal gear struts held, we might actually pull this off. The brakes screamed like banshees. Without engine power, I didn't have reverse thrust to help slow us down, so everything depended on mechanical braking and whatever drag I could create with the aircraft itself. I pulled back on the yoke, trying to use the wings as air brakes, feeling the aircraft shudder and vibrate as it fought against physics. We were decelerating, but not fast enough. The end of the runway was coming up like a brick wall, and beyond it was a grove of trees that would turn our successful emergency landing into a really spectacular failure. "Come on," I muttered through gritted teeth. "Come on, you bastard, slow down." The aircraft skidded sideways as one of the main gear tires finally gave up completely. We were sliding now, more than rolling, leaving black streaks of rubber and probably metal on the concrete behind us. The nose gear was vibrating so hard I thought it might shake itself apart. Eric was reading off distances, 1,000 feet of runway remaining. 800, 600. The trees were getting bigger. A lot bigger. I could see individual branches, could imagine the sound they'd make as we plowed through them at however many miles per hour we were still carrying. 400 feet, Eric called out. "We're not going to stop in time." But then, miraculously, impossibly, we did. At exactly 500 feet from the end of the runway, the aircraft shuddered to a complete stop. The sudden silence was deafening. No engine noise, no screaming brakes, no grinding metal. Just the distant sound of emergency sirens and the whistle of wind through damaged aircraft parts. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We just sat there in the cockpit, staring at the trees that we hadn't hit, trying to process the fact that we were alive. Then the cabin behind us exploded with sound. Not screams this time, but cheering. Applause. People crying with relief instead of terror. Someone was shouting, "We made it! We made it!" over and over again. I let go of the yoke slowly, my hands shaking like I had palsy. The control surfaces fell slack without hydraulic pressure, and I realized I could barely feel my fingers after gripping the controls so tightly for so long. Eric was staring at me like I'd just performed a magic trick. "How the hell did you do that?" I looked out the windscreen at the emergency vehicles racing toward us, their lights flashing, crews ready to evacuate passengers and check for injuries. Normal people doing normal jobs, dealing with what was probably the most abnormal day of their careers. I honestly don't know, I admitted. But there was something I did know, something that was echoing in my head like a broken record. A voice from my past, from performance evaluations and psychological assessments, and all the reasons they'd given for washing me out of the Air Force. For seconds, "You froze again. Next time, 0, asterisk." That's what they'd written in my file. For seconds of hesitation during a training exercise that had convinced them I couldn't handle pressure situations. For seconds that had ended my military career and destroyed my marriage and turned me into just another civilian with a drinking problem and a therapy appointment twice a week. But this time when it really mattered, when 200 lives hung in the balance, I hadn't frozen at all. I'd flown. The hearing room looked like something out of a legal drama. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they had tuberculosis, and a panel of officials who acted like they were deciding the fate of the free world instead of just reviewing an emergency landing. 5 members of the Federal Aviation Administration sat behind a long table covered with files, laptops, and coffee cups that had probably been refilled more times than anyone wanted to count. They'd been reviewing the incident for 3 weeks, analyzing every piece of data, every radio transmission, every decision I'd made during those 20 minutes when physics and luck were the only things standing between us and disaster. The room was packed with people who had various reasons for being there. Airline representatives in expensive suits, trying to figure out how to spin this whole thing to minimize their liability. Insurance investigators with their clipboards and calculators, adding up the cost of a damaged aircraft versus the potential lawsuits from 200 traumatized passengers. Reporters with their notebooks and recording devices, hoping someone would say something quotable that would give them another angle on the story. And sitting in the back, almost hidden behind a pillar, was Marielle. She'd been showing up to these proceedings like a ghost haunting her old life. Never spoke to me, never acknowledged my presence, just sat there watching everything unfold with those green eyes that had once made me forget my own name. I couldn't figure out what she was doing there or what she hoped to accomplish. The hearing had been going on for 2 days already. They'd reviewed the aircraft maintenance records, the weather conditions, the emergency response procedures. They'd interviewed the flight attendants, the passengers, even some of the emergency responders who'd been standing by at Twin Air Base. But today was my turn. The panel chair, a gray-haired woman named Patricia Walsh who looked like she'd been dealing with aviation bureaucracy since the Wright brothers, called me to the witness table. The microphone squeaked with feedback as I adjusted it, and I found myself staring at a room full of people who were all waiting to judge whether I'd done the right thing or just gotten lucky. Mr. Reeve, Walsh began, we've reviewed the preliminary reports and witness statements regarding flight KL-447. Before we discuss your actions during the emergency, could you please state your qualifications for the record? I opened my logbook, the same worn leather-bound book I'd been carrying since my first day of flight training 15 years ago. Every hour I'd ever flown was recorded in those pages, from my first solo flight in a Cessna 152 to my last mission as an F-16 pilot before everything went to hell. Jackson Reeve, former United States Air Force pilot. I began, my voice steady despite the circumstances. 15 years of military flight experience, including combat operations in 3 theaters. Certified on F-16 Fighting Falcon, T-38 Talon, and KC-135 Stratotanker aircraft. NATO qualified for international flight operations. Total flight time, 3,247 hours. One of the panelists, a younger guy who probably flew a desk more than he flew aircraft, leaned forward with a skeptical expression. Mr. Reeve, according to your military discharge papers, you were removed from flight status due to psychological concerns. Specifically, the evaluation states that you demonstrated hesitation during critical decision-making exercises. How do you reconcile that assessment with your actions during this emergency? There it was. The 4-second hesitation that had destroyed my military career and probably cost me my marriage. The moment of human uncertainty that had convinced a panel of psychologists that I couldn't be trusted with the responsibility of flying military aircraft. I looked at the panelist for a long moment, then opened my logbook to a page I'd marked with a small piece of paper. The evaluation you're referring to was based on a single training exercise conducted under simulated conditions, I said. During that exercise, I hesitated for approximately 4 seconds while processing multiple system failures in a T-38 trainer aircraft. The evaluating psychologist determined that this hesitation demonstrated unsuitability for continued flight operations. The room was dead quiet. Even the reporters had stopped scribbling in their notebooks. However, I continued, the evaluation failed to account for several factors. First, the simulated emergency was intentionally designed to be unsolvable using standard procedures. Second, my 4-second hesitation occurred while I was calculating alternative solutions that weren't covered in the training manual. Third, and most importantly, the evaluation was conducted in a controlled environment where the only consequence of failure was a poor grade. I closed the logbook and looked directly at the skeptical panelist. Flight KL-447 was not a controlled environment. There were no safety nets, no reset buttons, no opportunity to try again if I made the wrong decision. 200 lives depended on getting it right the first time. The panel chair made some notes on her legal pad, then looked up at me. Mr. Reeve, let's discuss your decision to access the emergency military communication system. That equipment is classified and restricted to authorized personnel only. What gave you the authority to use it? Nothing gave me the authority, I admitted. But someone in that cockpit needed to establish direct communication with air traffic control centers that could coordinate our emergency landing. Captain Vanderberg didn't have the training or clearance to use military communication protocols. I did. So you broke federal law. I saved 200 lives. Another panelist, an older man with the weathered look of someone who'd spent time in actual cockpits, spoke up. Mr. Reeve, walk us through your decision-making process during the final approach. Why did you choose to deploy the landing gear manually rather than attempt a belly landing? This was the technical stuff I could handle. Numbers and physics and engineering problems that had clear solutions if you knew what you were doing. A belly landing would have required a longer, perfectly smooth runway with emergency foam deployment, I explained. Twin Air Base didn't have foam capability, and the runway length was marginal for our approach speed. Deploying the gear manually was a calculated risk, but it gave us the best chance of stopping within the available runway distance. They asked about wind vectors and approach angles and descent rates. They wanted to know why I'd chosen to touch down nose gear first instead of following standard landing procedures. They questioned every decision I'd made during those final minutes when we were gliding toward what might have been disaster. They questioned every decision I'd made during those final minutes when we were gliding toward what might have been disaster. I answered every question with facts and figures and technical explanations. But what I really wanted to tell them was simpler than all the aviation jargon and regulatory compliance issues. When that aircraft lost both engines, there was no manual to follow. No procedure checklist that covered how to land a dead airliner with no hydraulics and no margin for error. There was just training and instinct and the absolute certainty that failure wasn't an option. The hearing lasted 6 hours. When it was over, when all the questions had been asked and all the forms had been filled out, I walked out of that building knowing I'd done everything right. But I also knew that being right and being vindicated were two very different things. As I pushed through the lobby doors into the afternoon sunlight, I saw Marielle standing by the parking garage elevator. She was alone, no Brent in sight. Just her, and a manila envelope she was clutching like it contained state secrets. For the first time in 2 years, she looked directly at me. Jackson, she said quietly, we need to talk. 3 weeks after the hearing, I got a phone call from Eric Vanderberg. The Dutch captain's voice was warmer over the phone than it had been in the cockpit during our emergency landing, probably because we weren't plummeting toward the ground at the time. Jackson, he said, some of the passengers want to organize a reunion. Nothing fancy, just a chance for people to meet the man who brought them home safely. Would you be interested? My first instinct was to decline. I'd had enough attention, enough scrutiny, enough people analyzing every decision I'd made during those 20 minutes when everything went to hell. The FAA had cleared me of any wrongdoing. The airline had quietly settled with passengers who'd filed injury claims, and the media had moved on to other stories about other people's triumphs and disasters. But something in Eric's voice made me reconsider. This wasn't about headlines or legal proceedings or corporate damage control. This was about the people who'd been in that cabin, who'd felt the aircraft shudder and shake and fall silent, who'd watched oxygen masks drop from the ceiling and wondered if they were going to see their families again. Where and when? I asked. The reunion was held at a small community center near Twin Air Base, the same runway where we'd made our emergency landing. About 60 passengers showed up. Not everyone, but enough to fill the room with conversations in half a dozen languages and the occasional burst of nervous laughter that comes from people who've shared a near-death experience. I recognized some faces from that chaotic day. The businessman from first class who'd grabbed my arm, looking much more relaxed in casual clothes instead of his expensive suit. The young mother with the infant, who introduced me to her baby like I was a favorite uncle. The elderly man who'd been gripping his armrests so tightly, now shaking my hand with steady fingers and thanking me in broken English. But it was the conversations that got to me. Not the formal thank you speeches or the polite expressions of gratitude, but the quiet, personal moments when people told me what that day had meant to them. A teenage girl showed me a college acceptance letter, telling me she'd decided to study aeronautical engineering because of what she'd witnessed in the cockpit. An older woman mentioned that she'd reconciled with her estranged sister after realizing how fragile life could be. A man in his 30s said he'd quit his job as an accountant and opened the restaurant he'd always dreamed about, because almost dying had taught him that safe choices weren't always the right choices. These weren't dramatic declarations or life-changing epiphanies. They were small, human moments of clarity that had grown out of 20 minutes of controlled terror at 30,000 feet. And somehow, my decision to step into that cockpit had been part of making those moments possible. Eric gave a short speech about aviation safety and the importance of emergency preparedness. The airline representative talked about improved training procedures and enhanced communication systems. Everyone was very professional and careful not to dwell too much on how close we'd all come to becoming a statistic in accident investigation reports. But then something unexpected happened. I saw her before she saw me, standing near the back of the room like she wasn't sure she belonged there. Marielle looked different somehow. Older, maybe, or just more uncertain than the confident woman who'd been mocking me from across the airline aisle 3 weeks ago. She was alone. No Brent, no expensive suit, no corporate consultant swagger. Just my ex-wife in jeans and a sweater, holding a manila envelope like it contained something fragile. When our eyes met across the room, she walked over with the kind of determined stride I remembered from our marriage. The same walk she'd used when she had something important to say and wasn't going to let anything stop her from saying it. "Hello, Jackson," she said quietly. "Marielle." I kept my voice neutral, professional. "I didn't expect to see you here." She glanced around the room at the passengers and their families, people who were alive because of decisions I'd made when everything was falling apart. "I needed to see this," she said. "I needed to understand what you did." She handed me the manila envelope without ceremony. "There's something you should know." Inside was a signed affidavit on law firm letterhead, admitting that Brent's firm had illegally obtained and leaked my military psychological evaluation to the press. There were emails detailing the information-gathering operation, financial records showing payments to private investigators, and a timeline that made it clear the character assassination had been planned and coordinated. But underneath the legal documents was a handwritten letter on personal stationery. Marielle's handwriting, the same careful script I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists and divorce papers. "Jackson, asterisk," it began. Asterisk, you weren't just a passenger that day. You were the only one flying. You were the only one who could have brought everyone home safely. And you did it without hesitation, without freezing, without any of the problems that the evaluations said you had. Asterisk. I've spent 2 years convincing myself that leaving you was the right decision. That you were broken, unstable, unable to handle pressure. I let Brent's investigation into your military records confirm what I wanted to believe, that I'd been smart to get out before things got worse. Asterisk. But watching you in that cockpit, seeing what you were capable of when it really mattered, I realized something I should have understood years ago. You weren't broken. You were just human. And sometimes being human in an inhuman situation is exactly what's needed. Asterisk. I can't undo the divorce. I can't take back the things I said or the way I let Brent attack you in the media. But I can tell you this. When that aircraft was falling out of the sky, there was only one person I trusted to save us. The same person I should have trusted to save our marriage. Asterisk. I'm sorry, Jackson. For everything. Asterisk. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. Around us, the reunion was winding down, passengers exchanging contact information and promising to stay in touch. Normal people returning to their normal lives, carrying with them the memory of a day when normal hadn't been enough. "Thank you," I told Marielle, "for the affidavit and the letter." "The affidavit should help Sabine with the legal case against Brent's firm," she said. "As for the letter," she shrugged. "I just needed you to know that I finally understand who you really are." I looked around the room one more time, at all these people who were alive because I'd remembered how to fly when it mattered most. At Eric Vanderberg, who trusted a stranger with the lives of his passengers. At passengers who'd found new directions in their lives because of 20 minutes of controlled chaos. "I'm the same person I always was," I told her. "You just weren't looking." Later that evening, I drove back to my hotel and opened my logbook to a fresh page. At the top, I wrote the date and the location. Then, In the space reserved for remarks, I wrote something I'd never put in any official record. Lesson learned. They tell you to hold steady when everything is falling apart. But sometimes holding steady isn't enough. Sometimes you have to fly. Asterisk. Final note. 4 seconds of hesitation in a training exercise doesn't define a pilot. 20 minutes of precision flying in a real emergency does. Asterisk. Teach them to hold steady, even when the world says they can't. Asterisk. Especially when the world says they can't. Asterisk. I closed the logbook and looked out the window at Twin Air Base in the distance, where emergency vehicles still stood ready for the next crisis, the next impossible situation that would require someone to do the impossible. Somewhere out there, another pilot was probably struggling with self-doubt, wondering if they had what it took when everything went wrong. Another marriage was probably ending because someone couldn't see past the psychological evaluations to the person underneath. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I'd landed the plane. I'd brought everyone home. And that was enough.